right. Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Christine Steger. I'm the Associate Director of the Institute of Behavioral Science, and I'm also an Associate Research Professor here in the Institute. Tonight is the third of our lectures of the public lecture series, and I just want to welcome you all again and thank you for being here. So before we get moving, I'd like to read CU Boulder's land acknowledgement. The University of Colorado Boulder, Colorado's flagship university, honors and recognizes the many contributions of Indigenous peoples in our state. CU Boulder acknowledges that it is located on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, and many other Native American nations. Now, to provide a little bit of background for this evening's lecture, the Institute of Behavioral Science is one of CU Boulder's 12 interdisciplinary research institutes, and it's the primary home of interdisciplinary social science. And the Institute has 5 research programs, and they range from population to prevention science to international development. And within those 5 programs, we have 8 centers. And these centers are focused on wide-ranging topics as varied as archaeology to resilience and well-being to violence prevention. And you can learn more from the posters we have in the back of the room. We also have some handouts here with our programs and centers on the back. So you can grab some of those and learn more about our important research and what we do here at the Institute. Okay, so as far as the layout tonight, Dr. Lori Peek will be giving a talk from, after I finish talking here, from about 6 p.m. to around 6:45. So it'll be about a 40-minute talk, then we'll do 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A. Okay, and after that, we'll wrap up about 7 p.m. or so, and then we have an informal reception with some snacks and drinks in the back and opportunities to socialize at that time and ask more questions, of course. Okay, so with that, I'm so pleased to now introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Lori Peek. Dr. Peek has had a long history with the Institute. She came to Boulder in 1999 as a graduate student in sociology, and at that time, she was hired as a research assistant in the Natural Hazards Center. She completed her PhD in 2005, and she moved up the road to Colorado State University, where she joined as faculty in sociology. And then in 2017, we were fortunate to hire her back to CU as a professor in sociology and the director of the Natural Hazards Center here in this institute. And it feels especially appropriate that Lori will be delivering the lecture tonight on Earth Day, where we celebrate environmental action for a safer planet. The Natural Hazards Center is committed to moving knowledge into action to help reduce natural hazards losses. Lori has dedicated her career to rigorously studying the people most at risk to disasters and identifying ways where we can help people keep safe. She is an internationally recognized expert in the sociology of disasters. She is the author of multiple award-winning books, nearly 100 peer-reviewed journal articles, and is currently the principal investigator on more than 20 million in federally funded and philanthropically funded awards. She is a researcher who cares deeply about the planet and people. I hope you'll join me in giving her a warm welcome. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone. Hi. It's good to see you this evening, and thank you for being here, and thank you for whatever you had to muster to get yourself into the seat that you are now in here in the Institute of Behavioral Science at the University of Colorado Boulder. It is a profound honor to have a chance to stand in front of you tonight to talk about something that I care so much about and in front of people, including the love of my life. If you saw me lay a kiss on somebody, that wasn't just random, that's my husband. As well as the founding director, as well as our another director of this institute, Richard Jesser and Jane Menken. And just a great honor to see friends, colleagues, and new faces in this room tonight. And I especially wanted to acknowledge the members of the Natural Hazard Center team who are here. One of our mantras at the center is that nothing that we do at the center do we do alone. And so I'm standing up here as a single person tonight, but I know I'm standing side by side with the people at that center and our students and staff. How many of you know when the study of disaster, the sociology of disaster began? And you can't answer if you're a sociology PhD student. So this study of human behavior in disaster began in earnest in the post-World War II period. And this was a period in the late 1940s and early 1950s, for those of us who weren't alive during that period, where there's great social anxiety. World War II ended, we were entering into the Cold War period, and the US federal government, and particularly the military, were very concerned about how members of our population would respond if caught unaware in the case of a nuclear or other outside attack. And so what they did was they started to fund these small field teams of researchers at universities across the United States to study other unexpected events like train derailments, tornadoes, floods, fires, and earthquakes. And they were interested in questions like, will people panic, riot, loot, or descend into social disorder? But what those early field research teams found very quickly was not that. And so over the past almost 80 years, we have accumulated an incredible storehouse of knowledge in the field of disaster research. But tonight, I want to touch on and weave throughout two fundamental social facts, enduring truths, things that we have learned time and time again across disaster, whether it be a hurricane, a tornado, an earthquake, or otherwise. So number one, disasters have deeply unequal impacts across society. While disasters are oftentimes characterized as acts of God or acts of nature, what we know on the ground is that disasters actually reveal the inequities that already exist in our society. Take, for example, in Hurricane Katrina, people over the age of 65 only made up about 12% of the pre-storm population. They made up over 60% of those who died in that disaster. That's what we're talking about when we talk about deeply unequal impacts in disaster. So that's social fact number one. Number two, even in the face of crisis, trauma, disruption, and upheaval, people want to help. The earliest disaster researchers up until today have been so taken by this that some of the foundational researchers in our community, they gave it a name. That's what social scientists like to do. We assign a concept to everything. And so some of those early researchers in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, they started calling this response of people wanting to help, people converging on the scene of a disaster to rescue fellow survivors, to help them begin the process of recovery, to provide material support and donations. They called that the altruistic or the therapeutic community. But one of the things that's worth knowing, the decades of research on this sort of convergent response where people are behaving in altruistic ways, all of that research, almost all of it, has been conducted by adults on things that adults do. So that means we don't know a lot about what younger people do in response to disaster. And so children have indeed historically been understudied and overlooked, and that also means that they've been underserved in a context of crisis. This began to change, however, when the sociologist William Anderson, rest in peace, in 2005 wrote a foundational article where he issued this seminal call to action among social and behavioral scientists, where he said, we need to start working to understand what children do for themselves and others to reduce disaster impacts. Fast forward, and Jen Tobin and I and a team of researchers worked together, and we worked on a paper where we reviewed nearly 70 years of research evidence on what we know about children in disasters. And one of the takeaways from that paper that we wrote was that Anderson's call actually ushered in this whole new wave of child-centered research focused on diverse children's knowledge, strengths, and capacities, what kids can do. And I was part of that wave of research. Bill Anderson was a mentor to me. He was a friend to so many. And his paper inspired me. I read it when I was in graduate school. And then in 2005, I graduated from the University of Colorado Boulder. Months later, Hurricane Katrina made landfall and laid waste to the Gulf Coast. 20 years on, it still stands as one of the most costly and deadly disasters in modern US history. Some 1.2 million people were displaced from the Gulf Coast of the United States and were scattered across all 50 states and several US territories. Alice Fothergill, also a CU Boulder alum and fellow sociologist, and I moved into action. We wanted to document children's experiences, their vulnerabilities, and their long-term recovery. And so we spent nearly 10 years after Hurricane Katrina documenting what happened to kids, but also responding to Bill's call. We paid attention to what kids did for themselves, what they were doing for other people, and also how they were helping their communities. And so I want to tell you a story now from one of the boys who we followed for over a decade, and I'm still in touch with now. He's now going to be 33 years old. And so Daniel is what we call him in the book. That is not his real name. Sorry. And so Daniel was one of hundreds of thousands of children who were living along the Gulf Coast when Hurricane Katrina made landfall. And Daniel was 12 years old at the time of Katrina, young African-American boy. And the year before Hurricane Katrina, his father had actually died. He had a heart attack, and he was the sole breadwinner in the family. And his father passed away. And so at the time of Katrina, it was only his mother, who had become a single mother, him and his baby sister. And when Katrina made landfall, their family, like many families along the Gulf Coast, thought that they had dodged a bullet because Katrina did indeed turn a sharp right and it missed New Orleans. But as we all know now, the levees that were ringing that city, that's shaped like a bowl, failed. And that city filled to 80% of water. And so Daniel and his mother and his baby sister were in their apartment building on the second floor. And as those levees started to fail and water started to rush into the city, their apartment started to flood. And his mother could not swim. And she started to panic because she had this baby infant. And it was Daniel who said to his mother, "Mom, you need to calm down, and I'm going to wrap this bed sheet around you. You're going to put my baby sister on your body, and I'm going to guide you through the water." And that is just what he did. He guided his mother, his sister, and himself through those murky, contaminated floodwaters for almost a mile. And they ended up at the Superdome, where they were for 6 days until they were eventually forcibly relocated to Baton Rouge via van. And then over the next 10 years, he and his family moved about 12 times. In Daniel's story, I hope that all of you felt and heard the incredible truth of children's vulnerability in disaster and also their capability. He and the many other children, the hundreds of children who we met after Hurricane Katrina, then inspired me and my team and my fellow students and colleagues, where we have traveled to disasters across the United States and around the world, and we've continued to document those fundamental truths. How are children vulnerable, but also how do they help? How do they show up in a disaster, like in the Christchurch earthquake in New Zealand in 2011, where hundreds of college students descended upon the Christchurch Emergency Management Authority and said, "We are here to help. We are forming the Student Volunteer Army," organized entirely by social media, and they went around and helped. They did for years after that disaster with the reconstruction. We documented several similar things after the BP oil spill, the Alaska earthquake, and Superstorm Sandy in New York City. So children's desire to help is real. There are also real barriers to helping, and I know we have a firefighter in the audience. Where's Miss Elizabeth and Tony? Hi. So there are real barriers to helping and reasons we do not integrate children into emergency management. And so first and foremost, there are real risks to children, including that, as you heard in Daniel's story, there are potential risks in the emergency period to children's lives. Also, after the BP oil spill along the Gulf Coast, we talked to so many teens along the four-state area that was so affected, and they said, we wanted to help, but they kept telling us no because of how small we are. They wanted to go up and like pick up the tar balls off the sand, and people rightfully told them no because of children's unique developmental stages, that sometimes it's not appropriate to engage children in certain helping behaviors. So that's important to acknowledge at the outset. Also, we know that formal emergency management agencies, often they have liability concerns, or they may not have formal onboarding processes for youth volunteers. Also, ageism, so stereotypes about young people. They're just on their phones all the time. Who's heard that recently? Funny, all the teens put their hands up in the room. They're on their phone all the time. They don't care. They just want to play video games. They have nothing to contribute. They're too young. And also, we know this, that even though children under the age of 18 in our United States make up nearly a quarter of our population, they have less power and very little decision-making authority. Children don't vote, and they are rarely in the room when decisions are being made about their lives. And so the consequence of this is that because children's voices are rarely heard, they're rarely in the room when those decisions are being made, we know that children continue to be cast on sort of either side of the spectrum. They're either vulnerable victims or they're highly resilient in disasters. And so how many of you have heard this? Like, oh, kids are so resilient. They're just like little red rubber balls. Yeah, they'll just bounce back, right? But of course, kids aren't little red rubber balls. They do not just bounce back without support and love and care. But they're also, save for infants and very young children, are not completely or totally vulnerable. And so, of course, the truth lies somewhere between those two extremes. And why this matters is that these stereotypes end up preventing young people from channeling their energy and their talents and their creativity into causes that matter to them. And so another mantra that I live by is that we must listen to children. We must listen first to young people about their hopes, their fears, their concerns, and their experiences. And so adhering to that mantra tonight, I am getting ready to another honor of my life, to introduce Liam. If you would join me up here, and I'm going to share a little bit of story about how Liam came to join me here. A round of applause, please. You don't even know who he is. Let's just acknowledge how much courage it takes to even stand in front of a room full of people, right? Public speaking is like one of the greatest fears. We know that. So thank you for your courage. And so, how I came to meet Liam was actually through this extraordinary woman, Jerry Curry, who has been leading the Marshall Rock group in the aftermath of the Marshall Fire, which occurred on December 30th, 2021. And I want to acknowledge that there are several people in this room who were directly impacted in the Marshall Fire, and that many of these people are still in active states of recovery, because as we also know, recovery doesn't always have an endpoint. It's much more of a process. And so Jerry, when she found out I was giving this talk, so we've worked through the Hazard Center to help coordinate research teams that went out in the aftermath of the Marshall Fire to try to lower the burden on affected communities. So we weren't fielding like 100 surveys, we were fielding one unified survey. And so we've helped to coordinate those research teams. And so that's how I met Jerry, as this like hero who is helping to bring the community together. And so when Jerry found out I was giving this talk, she said, "Oh boy, howdy, do I have someone to introduce you to?" And that is how I met Liam. And Liam is getting ready to share his story with us. And so I'm going to pull up your slide and I'm going to hand you a mic to make sure, thank you, that everyone can hear you. And before Liam begins, can we give him another round of applause to give all the energy? Thank you.
Is this a good volume, everybody? Great. As Lori already mentioned, I'm Liam Kopetsky. I'm a junior at Fairview, and I'm so honored to speak with you all today and share my story and my persistences about what I've been through and how I was able to find light in these times of hardship. So thank you all for being here. Waking up that morning, I remember trying to go back to bed many different times, knowing that when I woke up, I'd be back on my queen-size bed, which is a little big for a 12-year-old, I will admit. In my room that was only half a hallway from my brother's, knowing that this nightmare would end and my feet would touch the white carpet with a square-like pattern, and I would gaze up and see the laundry bin in the corner, littered with missed basketball attempts from the night before, that I was too lazy to move a few feet into the hamper. But in reality, it wasn't a dream. It was what my life had become. December 30th, 2021, 100-mile-per-hour winds hit the Front Range. My family and I were down in Denver for a chiropractic appointment when I heard about an uprising in flames that had just topped Cherryvale Road. I was only 12, a 7th grader who was full of innocence. The thought never occurred to me that I would not return to that home that I had previously left that morning, owning nothing but what I was wearing. I had heard my parents on the phone, asking my grandma to grab our dog and 2 cats. At the time, it was only precautionary. There was no evacuation warning that was sent out. I was scared because my parents had always said that as long as I had a roof over my head, food on the table, and a few sparkling waters to drink, I was living life to the fullest. But how could that comfort me now that I didn't have this roof over my head anymore? My parents became quickly busy, and I didn't want to feel like a burden. For all I knew, they were going through the same stresses as I was. I found a newfound sense of recognition through my friends, and through a couple therapy sessions, I discovered that these emotions would come and go, as if they were ocean waves. It was the baseball practices, where I would be fielding ground balls with my team, only to break down with no warning at all, and the ski trips up to the mountains, the beautiful views and the sunlight on my face. When halfway down the mountain, I would lay in the snow and feel as if a piece of my heart was ripped from my body. My journeys were these waves, where in the downs I needed love and acknowledgement, and in the ups I needed space to move on. I began to grow up in a new world, feeling like there was a predetermined structure to my life, the before times and the current, more chaotic times. However, little did I know that this structure in which I heard all throughout my childhood wasn't a physical home, but instead a metaphorical roof of arms I could collapse into when I was having a hard day. Arms that, no matter how hard I fell, would always catch me. To me, this space to move on was giving back to my community, just how they had supported me right after the fire. This became a way for me to cope, move on, and grow. With some help, I organized events that invited teens like myself to connect and speak to one another. This started out as a small act around our neighborhood, helping neighbors with projects along the way. When the Maui fire happened, I helped with a farm stand to raise money for those survivors. Ultimately, I became involved with Jerry Curry in the Marshall Recovery Center. My brother Soren and I helped with the Marshall Rock Food Pantry for fire survivors. They then asked me for my help planning events that would reach community teens. I helped organize an ice cream social in Superior with kickball and yard games. I also volunteered at a concert event for kids my age. I wanted these events to be attended by all teens, not just those affected by the fire. Displayed within my family and community, this roof of arms is what ultimately allowed me to develop a character within myself, one that I never thought I would see. Helping others allowed me to help myself. Now I can say that I wouldn't trade this life for anything. I wouldn't change anything about myself, as every little detail makes up who I am today.
Mm. Thank you. And Liam, I have a copy of this book for you because you, like the children of Katrina, a child of the Marshall Fire, you exhibit incredible resilience and strength and capacity. And so thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Liam, thank you so much. And I want to acknowledge that Liam's parents, grandparents, girlfriend, and little brother are well, extraordinary people. I also want to acknowledge something powerful. We actually practiced this talk. Liam skipped a little school on Monday, and we practiced this talk on Monday. And one of the things that Jerry shared was to stop and pause for a minute and think, Liam, you're 17 now, 16. Soon moving back in their house, but 25% of his life has been lived as a Marshall Fire survivor. But I want to step back even a little more. What year were you born? 2009? 2009. In the years since Liam has been born, right here in Boulder, Colorado, we've had the 2013 Colorado floods, of course, the onset of the pandemic, the Calwood fire, the mass shooting at King Soopers, as well as, of course, the Marshall Fire. And that's just here in Boulder, Colorado. Across the United States, more than 90% of children, some 67 million, live in counties that were hit by disasters over the past decade. And this study, which was by Rebuild by Design, that looked at disaster data across the United States, found that many of those counties, like ours, it wasn't just a one and done. Some endured as many as 12 federally declared disasters, and those are just the biggest ones. That doesn't represent the sort of more routine disasters that are upending so many people's lives. And so on this Earth Day, 56th Earth Day, I wanted to say this, that we know that children of today and future generations, they are inheriting an ever more turbulent world, a world that's being marked by climate change, rising economic inequality, rising forms of authoritarianism, and other shocks that are upending people's lives. And I think that we have both an intellectual as well as a moral responsibility to listen to and learn from the kids who are coming of age in this current moment. And so to that, I want to turn to another Boulder youth. So in June of 2020, the Boulder Daily Camera ran this story that, of course, caught my eye. So it was about Centennial Middle School student Noni Murdoch. Did anybody in here go to Centennial Middle School? Anybody? Nobody? So Noni in 2020 was a middle school student there, 13 years old, and she and her grandmother, who was in Maryland, they were trying to figure out how to connect during this time of great isolation and upheaval. And so what they did was they decided they would write a book together. And they wrote this book, Squeakquestered, that was published within months of the onset of the pandemic and the lockdowns and so forth. And it's an illustrated book about a family of mice and a rabbit stuck inside because of a lurking cat. I think you all get the metaphor. And so, but within the book, then they give advice about how even when the lurking cat is keeping us locked down and locked inside, how we can still connect and find love and care with one another. And so I read that article in the Boulder Daily Camera, and I will admit it kind of jetted me back to life because I, like everyone else, was locked down, locked inside with my beloved husband and our beloved dog. And it was like, Lori, come on, you study what kids do in disaster. You can also study it during a pandemic. You just may need to use a little different methods. And so some of the questions that I was holding with me after reading that article and from the past work were wanting to know, what did children do to help others during the pandemic? Who did they assist, and what motivated children to act? And so in terms of children in the COVID-19 pandemic, even though this was a global phenomenon, millions of people perished around the world, 1 million in the United States alone. Again, as with other past disasters, to date, more than 5 years on since the onset of the pandemic, there's still only a limited body of research on children during the pandemic. And this is obviously a critical gap given the scale of the catastrophe, its deadly effects, and the ongoing and disruptive impacts to children's lives, relationships, and education. And so looking at my favorite school principal right now, the effects are ongoing. And so with the pandemic, it's obviously critically important that we learn from this. And another myth that I want to bust tonight is related to a lot of people, would say things like, oh, children can't die from COVID-19. They're not really at risk. That is untrue. By 2023, COVID-19 had actually became the leading cause of death in the United States for children under the age of 18 with disparities. Black and Latinx children were the most likely to die in the pandemic. And there were some 265,000 children across this country who were left bereaved because they lost their parents in the pandemic. And so we really do have a COVID generation on multiple dimensions that deserve our attention. Where we turned our lens during the pandemic was trying to figure out what were children doing during this disaster. And so I worked together with 2 of my graduate students at the Natural Hazard Center, as well as Alice from our Katrina study. And we built a database of 115 media articles that appeared in print between 2020 and 2023. And so what was in the data set, Zoe and Melissa spent months building this data set where they searched through LexisNexis, which is a database that holds all local, state, national, and international media. And we were specifically looked for any article we could find that focused on children's altruism or helping behaviors during the pandemic. And they search and search and search. We did. And in the end, we were only able to identify 115 articles, which is a finding in and of itself. We could only find 115 news media articles that focused on children's helping and uplifted children's voices and their actions. So what's not in the data set? We found thousands of articles that, again, Zoe and Melissa had to sort through and move out of the data set into another data set. We found thousands of articles about adults and what adults were doing for kids, what adults were concerned about with kids, but not with kids' voices. We also know that for sure what I'm getting ready to share with you, the actions I'm going to share, undoubtedly children undertook many, many, many other actions than what we were able to document, but I'm going to share with you tonight what we were able to document based on those data. And so we worked together. A couple of months ago, we published a journal article from this study, and we also published the data set so that other people could come in and look at all the articles that we amassed. And so in sort of sum of what we found children did during the pandemic, we found that they did 2 big sort of categories of things. And so one was related to providing material resources, and the other related to mobilizing, coming together to advance well-being. And so to help others, to try to advance health, social, emotional, physical health among people, as well as to enhance community and education. And so I'm going to walk you through briefly what we found in those articles and give you some examples to give some texture of what we learned the children did in these articles, featured in these articles. So first, under the providing material resources category, there were 3 types of helping behaviors that we grouped together as we were analyzing these data. And so first, there was making, collecting, and distributing supplies, which was about 30% of the articles, raising and donating money, about 19% of the articles, and then cooking or distributing food, which was about 15% of the articles. And so for those children, and here these were children between the ages of 5 and 18, that we were able to document different things they were doing. So what the purpose of this action was where children were trying to fill urgent needs. Think back, everybody, to March, April of 2020. What were people using in emergency rooms to cover their faces? Here in Colorado, they were using ski masks, bandanas. Think back, because they couldn't get their hands on personal protective equipment. Think back to that moment. And so children were trying to fill these urgent needs of developing personal protective equipment, sewing masks, getting basic supplies like clothing, toiletries, and other basic needs like school-related needs to kids. And so a couple of examples of that. The picture on your left, that's a high school girl in Georgia. Her father was a medical doctor. And so he was going in every single day, and he was one of those doctors that did not have access to an N95. And so she said, my school has a 3D printer. I'm going to bring that home and see if I can print 12 for 15. Before you knew it, she printed 600 face shields that then became instrumental in this hospital's response. The little boy on the right, 7 years old from Texas, he saw that people in his community were missing basic hygiene supplies, especially among unhoused residents and other vulnerable residents. He collected over 6,000 material goods, so masks, gloves, basic hygiene for his community. Second example of providing material resources was related to raising and donating money. And so a lot of these stories focus on like children who took their piggy banks and they emptied it out. So sort of these very heartfelt children giving away whatever they had in their savings or doing things to try to raise money to support a cause that they cared about. And so an example of this from the highly credible news source People magazine that we were able to find, this young girl, 7 years old, is actually a cancer survivor. And when the pandemic, the onset of the pandemic, the children's hospital where she had been treated was absolutely overrun, understaffed. And so she started making those friendship bracelets that I hope you can see on her arms. In the end, she sold those bracelets and raised about $23,000 for a children's hospital that she was treated at. Also, in terms of cooking and distributing food, children recognized and they worked to address immediate needs around hunger, and also they were trying to solve more systemic needs that they were seeing in their community. And so these 2 teen boys who are from Maryland, they said the following. They said, we thought maybe there are people in vulnerable populations out there, especially seniors, who don't have family to rely on during these times. And one of them, the one on the left, said, I think maybe I can make their life a little bit easier and also reduce the risk. So what they created was a contactless grocery delivery service. And so not only did they start it out and they started helping all the seniors in their neighborhood, they recruited 60 other teenagers in the surrounding areas in Maryland to join their cause that they ended up calling Teens Helping Seniors to get this vital food into seniors' homes. So second major category, mobilizing to advance well-being. So these were the types of helping behaviors that we documented in the media database. And so there was creating art, which is about 38% of the articles. This was actually the most represented in this category. Offering social and emotional support to others, about 36% of the articles. Providing tutoring or other educational services, about 18% of the articles. Participating in public health or vaccination efforts was about 8%. And then conducting or taking part in research was 5% of ways kids helped. And I want to note for those paying attention and taking notes, like the Fairview student in the back getting extra credit for being here. You're doing great. These don't add up to like 100% because a lot of the articles focus on multiple helping behaviors. And so I just want to give a few examples of this. And so creating art, kids did all kinds of things. They painted rocks, they made fiber arts, they made clothing for frontline workers. They did all kinds of things in this artistic landscape. This picture, though, that I want to share is a painting that was actually featured in the New York Times around things kids were doing to try to cope with emotional health struggles during the pandemic. So this is called Ring by 17-year-old Shashank Solgum. And he wrote, when he was writing a caption to his painting, he said, "This is me waiting for a friend to pick up the phone. I value human connection much more than I did prior to the pandemic, and I make it central in my routine. A simple phone call can be the bridge between worlds. Me and my peers were hit hard by the isolation of quarantine, but we're rebounding with a resolve to connect beyond boundaries. We strive to maintain and grow the web of interactions that keep us whole." And I want to say that I am using this photo tonight with the permission of Shashank, which again, thanks to the thing called the interweb. I found him on Instagram. I wrote him and said how I found his art in an article, and I asked him if I had permission to use it in a journal article and presentations, and he said I would be honored. So he gave us permission to look at this and share his words. Other ways that young people mobilize to advance well-being included offering social and emotional support to their peers, to elders, to their family members. Even one 7-year-old recognized that his teen nanny was going to miss her high school prom. He put on a high school prom for her, where he put on a little suit and she was in her prom dress and they had a prom together. That's social and emotional support, right? This Teen Line is actually a teen talk to text service that's been around. It was talk to talk, it became talk to text, then it became talk to email. Teen Line has been around for decades, and what they do is teens who are in crisis or needing some additional emotional support, they can contact Teen Line volunteers who are teenagers who've gone through 65 hours of training in trauma-informed care. And during the pandemic, they expanded their services exponentially, both because of demand, but also because of teens who are wanting to help. Providing tutoring or other educational services. And so, of course, the pandemic, like all disasters, revealed all kinds of disparities related to kids who didn't even have the internet, so could not do online learning, did not go to a school that had the resources to have computers, or they were already lagging behind in their school and then fell even further behind. So we documented lots of cases that we were able to read about and learn about of kids doing things for other kids within their schools. And I want to highlight this young hero, Josiah Aka, who's 7 years old, who go to YouTube. He has his own little mathematicals YouTube channel. And he, during the pandemic, started delivering English and Spanish language tutoring in math because he recognized the following in Josiah's words. "I knew half the time they are just going to sit on their video games all the time like my brother does. To prevent that from happening, let's also teach them some math." Josiah, again, Spanish and English, and I'm calling him a teacher. He is a math teacher, and Miss Elizabeth, let's try to hire him. Spanish and math teacher, and also voted by his preschool class, most likely to be next president of the United States. And so the second he turns 35, I hope he gets all of our votes. Here's what a mother, like only a mother, can sum up. This child has been unique from the time he was born. Children also did things like participated in public health efforts, sharing public health messaging. Remember, what were the things we needed to do during the pandemic? Wash our hands, wear a mask, and keep 6 feet apart. Those 3 messages. What a public health success in terms of those 3 elegant messages. So teens shared those messages. They also participated in early vaccine trials. Children were the last to get the COVID-19 vaccine. And we owe thanks to young people who were courageous and engaged in these trials. We also had documentation of children who they said, getting the vaccine is my act of helping. I'm helping my family, I'm helping my school. But then also some teens, like this teen here, they went and they spoke out on behalf of public health initiatives. And so this is Kaylin Park, only 10 years old. And she went to her school board meeting that was very contentious, very fractious. And she said afterwards, it is super weird to me to be here at a school board meeting because adults don't think that their children should wear masks. You guys should be able to know that masks save lives. And she got shouted down at the school board meeting. And that's why these women who are surrounding her trying to support her in uplifting this voice. So conducting or taking part in research was a loss. We only found like 5 articles on this. To the disaster nerds who are out there, I see you. But there were lots of things that kids tried to do, like through local colleges where they tried to involve school children or high school children. This happened on the East Coast as well, where there was this American Iraqi public health teams addressing COVID-19 research project where they actually partnered American teens with Iraqi teens to learn about our different public health responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. So bringing this plane to a land. Why did children help? So first, as we were reading across the articles, there were a variety of different explanations that we grouped into 3 different categories. So one, some of the kids helped because of what we came to call generalized empathy. So they'd say, people are hurting, people are suffering, I need to do what I can with what I have to help right now. And so there was this sort of generalized empathy. Some children helped because they had a personal connection to the pandemic. And so this young girl, her grandmother was in an elderly care home and then of course went under isolation and she could no longer see her in person. And so she started this whole initiative of getting other teens to write letters and notes to isolated elders during the pandemic. And so sometimes these personal connections really prompted people and their recognition of the impacts. Which leads to the third reason why children helped was that we saw across the articles that many times who children were trying to help, often the most vulnerable or who they perceived as the most vulnerable in their communities, and their recognition of the profound needs that the pandemic both revealed and also exacerbated. Their recognition of the injustices of the pandemic and the unequal effects. Thank you for listening so carefully tonight. I want to end with a few takeaways, and then Liam's going to come back up here with me in a minute to close this out and to land the plane before we turn it over to all of you. So I want to emphasize the following that, well, let me ask this before I shut it. How many of you felt good when you heard those stories? Like inspired, motivated, like, those kids, don't let people tell you kids are no good ever. But this is what I want to emphasize, that they're not just feel-good stories. That children are making a measurable impact. I put a few of those metrics up there. In the article, we actually quantify like how much money did the kids raise, how many masks did they sew and print and so forth. And so children are making a measurable difference in people's lives, their schools, and their communities. And we should pay attention to this. This isn't just fluff. This is kids' lives. But I also want to emphasize this is not always without a cost. So just like young Kaylin being courageous and getting shouted down at the school board meeting, another story of that. In Sag Harbor, New York, small town in upstate New York by Lake Ontario, like many kind of rural, smaller communities, they had this volunteer emergency medical service running the ambulance, running all this, and slowly all the volunteers who were mostly older adults stopped coming to work because of the fears of the pandemic, the public health threats. So who stepped up? There were actually 8 teenagers who came in and said, we have to keep this ambulance running or we don't have help for our community. And so 8 teenagers did that and they kept the emergency medical services running. But what happened was, because it was during the day, they started being let out of school. And the school said, you don't need to come to school, but a kid's #1 job is to learn. And a kid needs to be in school. And so there are costs, real costs sometimes to helping because there's a role conflict. Second takeaway, We need to keep researching and documenting children's vulnerabilities. Again, this isn't just a feel-good story. There is of course real harm and suffering always in disasters, and we need to pay attention to that. We also need to give equal attention to children's altruistic acts, their helping behaviors, and how they're contributing. And we know that this can improve lots of institutions within our society, how we do emergency management, how we educate children across all age groups, and many other areas. And third, children are becoming unintentional disaster experts through their lived experience. Like it or not, children are coming of age in a world that is hotter and drier than ever before. They're coming of age in a world that either has too much water or too little. They're coming of age in a world where more and more communities are being affected by compounding, cascading, and complex hazards that are affecting children's lives, not in additive ways, but in multiplicative ways. And so they are becoming disaster experts, and we refer to this in the paper as a kind of what we learned about through what kids did in the pandemic as a kind of liberatory disaster literacy, that it's not just that they understand what disasters do and what to do in the face of it, they also understand those systemic risks that are driving the unequal impacts, and they tried to respond in kind. And so with that, Liam, could you please come up here with me? Another round of applause for Liam. So we wanted to ask all of you first. We want you to take 20 seconds and think about what is one thing, based on what we hope you learned and heard tonight, what is one thing that you think you could do differently in your life or do in your life with what you learned tonight? 20 seconds. Okay. And with that, I'm not going to do any of that for the adults because that's on you. What's your call to action and your takeaway? Liam is going to have the final word tonight where he's going to issue a call to action for young people and what we could do for young people. So Liam, over to you.
Thank you, Lori. As just a concluding factor, just in the face of adversity, I think really putting yourself out there and helping your community with the hardships that they are going through, as well as helping yourself through those community members and the cohesion in which you can work in order to make a stronger life for everybody around you and everyone going through that disaster. And ultimately, in a way like Lori's bouncy ball, right? You can drop the ball, but it won't come all the way back up, right? Because it's fighting gravity. Give it some force. Give it a way to bounce back fully, and give it a way to really come back to you in a way that it wouldn't have originally. And I think that little bit of force is the way that we can reach out to the community and help everyone around us for the better. Thank you all very much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lori and Liam. Fantastic job. We want to open it up for questions at this time. We have about 10 minutes or so until 7. So if you have to go at 7, feel free to just get up. And there are some snacks in the back, so you can grab something and go if you need to. Otherwise, we welcome everyone to stay and socialize and ask more questions and interact with each other. So questions. I'm going to bring you the microphone because it's just easier for people to hear in such a big room.
Hi there. You spoke about a young man at the beginning, I forget his name, who's now 32, you said. How is he doing?
Oh, thank you. And what's your name?
Linda.
What brought you here tonight, Linda?
Husband. I'm a retired pediatric RN, and
Aw.
I've worked with kids a lot. And he volunteers to and teaches kids about nature through Boulder County Open Space.
Uh,
And anyway, so yeah.
Linda, I'm going to give you some unsolicited advice. Keep him. Thanks for coming. And thank you for asking. So Daniel is 33 years old now. He actually relocated to Houston, Texas, where he works full time, lives in an apartment there. His mom and his sister are still in New Orleans, and Daniel's doing pretty well as you can do when you are profoundly economically on the profound economic margins. There's sort of never a bounce back from what was already a real economic struggle at the time of Katrina. His baby sister is having a lot harder time. She's having a lot harder time, a lot of enduring mental health struggles. And so I think there are a lot of open questions in this area of disaster research about sort of that long tail of disaster, how kids at different ages and stages of development, how it then plays out in their lives based on their social context. But he's doing okay, and he is still the effervescent every time I look at him 12-year-old that I first met. He's amazing. He got his first job so he could buy his sister Christmas presents. So yeah, it's amazing. And will you tell us, while Christine's coming over with the mic, will you say your name and what brought you here tonight? Okay, thank you.
My name is Susan, and I'm a neighbor of Liam.
Oh,
Close family friends.
Liam has like a whole fan club here, so everybody knows. It's clear.
My question is a little bit to bounce off of that, because I'm curious about that long tail is what I wanted to inquire about. What does your research show in terms of the longer term impact to kids in particular, but probably adults as well, in terms of physical health, mental health, other long tail effects? I think I'm just curious about what the science says there.
Yes, so we know the most about.
May I add one comment?
Of course.
Okay. We are all fire survivors, so that's where, and she has a daughter about Liam's age and similar impact. So that's a little addition to it.
Thank you so much for asking about that. And as with many things, I mean, I think this rubber ball metaphor that we've been using throughout is appropriate, that we do know a lot. Children's mental health has actually been the most studied, sort of those in that paper I talked about, we were looking at what are all the things that have been studied in disasters. Children's mental health in the aftermath of disaster has actually been studied quite robustly over time, but with some issues, including that much of that research is based on adult report of kids' mental health. It's, again, this 2005 call, I can't emphasize how important that was, because it was like, oh, we'll ask the teachers how they're doing, or we'll ask the parents. One of the things Alice and I learned from asking the kids, they said, we're hiding how we're feeling from our parents because we don't want to burden them, because they're already overburdened, they've lost their homes. And we also, we want to talk to our friends. Liam actually told me that the first time I talked to him too. And so it's real. And so we actually think, based on some of our qualitative data collection, that we think there's actually been sort of an underreporting of the long tail effects of children's mental health because of relying on adult report. But over the past 20 years, we've had a lot more direct surveys, longitudinal long-term studies with children. And you know, it's varied. I think the biggest takeaway is children that have the fewest resources before a disaster, they oftentimes have the most exposure, the most impacts, and then they have the fewest resources in the aftermath to recover. And so that's sort of one generalized story. But then when you look up close, there are lots of evidence-based interventions of things that we can do to help kids. And so it is all about like giving that additional push to get the ball back up in the air. So yeah, and it's really paying attention to kids over the long term. We know that anniversary events can be very triggering for adults as well as children. Paying attention to how young people want to receive mental health support and care. There are lots of other sources of support around that. And I would love to, if I could ever be of further service to help in that regard. Thank you. Thank you.
Question in the back here.
Hi.
Hello. What made children feel that mutual aid was obvious rather than exceptional?
What made them feel like that? Well, of course we should do this. Yeah, that's a good question. I think for some of the young people, they were already involved in their schools and their communities. And so, right, it was just, this is an extension of what we're already doing. But for other young people, sometimes it was that adults were creating initiatives like Marshall Rock and said, we need young people's perspectives. And so they might have drawn them in. That's just an example from the current context. But in the pandemic, it was some mix of like people drawing people in. So again, the power of social networks, things that people were doing in advance. And sometimes the losses were just so profound and so blaringly obvious that some of the kids, they said in their quotes were like, how could I not help? What moral clarity those young people had, right? Like, how could I not help? How could I not try to do things for the frontline workers? One of the children said, they're putting their lives on the line for us. How can I not act? And so I think it was, I mean, it was obviously, as with all things, complicated and a lot of different explanations. But I think, again, goes back to that desire to help in disaster is profound. Thank you. And then Jane.
Hi, I'm Jane Mencken, and I had the great good fortune to be Lori Peek's professor in her first methods class, the first year she came to graduate school. She was fantastic then and only has become more fantastic. So thank you both. But my question for you, Lori, now is how can you help? Do you have advice to incorporate into policies and practices in disasters that would further the involvement of children with their voices, not imposing on them, but allowing voices to emerge?
Oh, thank you for asking that. And thank you for being my teacher forever. None of us are here without all of us. So yes, I do. And I think one of the greatest, after Katrina, one of the greatest sort of policy changes that we witnessed in this nation was that there was a National Commission on Children in Disasters that was actually formed by President George W. Bush because of the profound suffering and loss that was witnessed in Hurricane Katrina. And so this National Commission came together and they made over 70 recommendations, many of them policy recommendations, for what we should be doing to enhance pediatric preparedness, improve response, and enhance long-term recovery for kids. Save the Children, as one of the nation's leading child advocacy groups, tracked the implementation of those recommendations for a decade after. Only a handful of them were ever implemented. So I feel like, as with many things, we have the knowledge, we have the expertise, we have the know-how. Now we need the will. We need the political will. And one big thing that did happen after Katrina, the U.S. Federal Emergency Management Agency did have someone that was the first ever, again, this was a post-Katrina intervention. They named a children in disaster coordinator for the nation. Extraordinary role. They set up youth preparedness councils. So like Liam could have been the FEMA Region 8 Youth Preparedness Council. So again, it was listening to children, it was integrating them, it was helping them to improve our systems. After 2025, that role, as well as the disability coordinator role, were eliminated. And so we no longer have someone at that. And so I think we need to document what was working, what interventions have been put in place, what recommendations have been made that were never adopted, and come together and use our voices for that greater good. Thank you for asking that.
Okay, it's a few minutes after 7. I think we will have one more question, and then we can continue, of course.
Hi, my name's Nicholas. I'm a senior in the public health program here at CU Boulder. I'm also from Houston, Texas, so I've lived through my fair share of Harvey and a lot of, COVID. Has there been any research or like any intrigue on like social media platforms as a method for youth to share like information and resources during disasters? Because I know for at least my social circles, that was a huge like source for us during those times.
Yes, that is a great question. And I'm standing next to a digital native. And so I'm actually going to ask him a slightly different, because I love your question. But I want to say 2012 was like a banner year. And why was 2012 such an important year? You've read either iGen or Anxious Generation, haven't you? 2012 was the year that smartphones became ubiquitous. So 2011, during the Christchurch earthquake, this was a big moment in sort of disaster research and using social media. So that student volunteer army, the way they organized was through Facebook. And so it was one of the first times that we were able to document sort of the use of social media for kids to mobilize. To take you even back a little further, in 2005, after Katrina, the ways that families found each other who didn't know what happened, it was through MySpace. Who remembers MySpace? That's into the dustbin of social media. So there was MySpace, but during the Christchurch earthquake was when young people used Facebook to find each other and then to get integrated into the the emergency response apparatus. And so that then sparked a lot of interest in this, among other things. So it is a great question. I think it's still an area so ripe for further research. And so, as has been appropriate tonight, Liam, will you tell us, picking up on that, did social media play a role in you and Soren recruiting other young people to be in Marshall Rock? And you're going to get to answer the last question before we break.
Yeah, actually, the first thing I said when I met Jerry, and she was like, okay, how can we put this out there? How can we put this into the world and put it out there to the point where we can make an impact? And the first thing I thought of was like social media. What if I post this, get people, because it allows us to broaden the effect in a much bigger way, right? It allows us to put it out there into the community, and it allows for a much bigger impact. And that was one of my primary experiences in how I incorporated social media into ultimately helping people and providing a larger impact. And honestly, I wanted to go back to your question and how to provide teens with the opportunity to make an impact. And I think it's making these opportunities for them and allowing them to step up, right? If you give them an opportunity to speak out, they will speak out, right? And I think that's the biggest way to incorporate these teens into the disaster relief and give them their own ability in order to speak out and things like that. That's right. Give them a voice.
Thank you. Well, that's
great.
Perfect end. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, I know there were a few last questions, so Lori and Liam will be sticking around for a bit. If you want to ask them your questions, feel free. So this is our last lecture, public series lecture of this semester. If you can believe it, it's finals week next week. And we are going to continue these public lectures in the fall again. And so because you all have RSVP'd through Eventbrite, we have your contact information, and we'll let you know of our first lecture in the fall when that happens. So thank you again. We appreciate your support, and I hope you learned something and you met some new people and can continue to do that here. So thanks again, and have a great night.